In of the story of the woman who was caught in adultery, which we looked at last week. And we mentioned last week of that passage that there's some uncertainty about its location, whether this is the correct place in the Gospels where it is to be found. We could read from chapter 7, verse 52 and pick up at chapter 8, verse 12, and the flow isn't really interrupted at all by that story that comes in between them. So you could ignore that and just go straight from chapter 7, verse 52 into chapter 8 and verse 12, and you wouldn't lose any sort of thread of the discussion. But the discussion we've seen here in chapter 7 and now into chapter 8 is taking place in Jerusalem in the temple at the time of these miracles. That's the setting for all of this. So we're going to begin here in John chapter 8. We'll read from verse 12 down to verse 20 to begin. Again, Jesus spoke to them, saying, I am the light of the world. He who follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. The Pharisees then said to him, You are bearing witness to yourself. Your testimony is not true. Jesus answered, Even if I do bear witness to myself, my testimony is true, for I know whence I have come and whither I am going. But you do not know whence I come or whither I am going. You judge according to the flesh. I judge no one. Yet even if I do judge, my judgment is true, for it is not I alone that judge, but I and he who sent me. In your law it is written that the testimony of two men is true. I bear witness to myself, and the Father who sent me bears witness to me. They said to him, therefore, Where is your Father? Jesus answered, You know neither me nor my Father. If you knew me, you would know my Father also. These words he spoke in the treasury as he taught in the temple, but no one arrested him because his hour had not yet come. There's no mention here of the people, of the crowds in general who were around at that time. So it appears to be a continuation of the discussion between Jesus and the religious leaders. The Pharisees are mentioned there in verse 13. And the setting is once again the temple. We're still in the temple, as verse 20 indicates that he spoke these words in the treasury as he taught in the temple. And in verse 59, or the final verse of the chapter as well, so they took up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. So all that's been going on here in chapter 7 and now into chapter 8 is taking place there in the temple and at the time of the Feast of Tabernacles. Jesus makes here in verse 12 another of his startling claims. He says, I am the light of the world. He who follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. This is the second of the I am statements that we find in John's Gospel. There are 7 altogether. The first was in chapter 6, where Jesus said, I am the bread of life. So this is the second now, I am the light of the world. And the claim to be the light of the world is one which is repeated later in chapter 9 and verse 5, in the story of the man who was blind from birth. In chapter 9, verse 5, Jesus said there, as long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. And then further on in chapter 12 and verse 46, he says, I have come as light into the world, that whoever believes in me may not remain in darkness. In chapter 7, we saw how on the last day of the Feast of the Tabernacles, Jesus had made the claim, if anyone thirst, let him come to me and drink. He who believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart shall flow rivers of living water. And at the time we said that this claim may have been said in the context of the ceremony that took place at the Feast of Tabernacles, in which water was poured out around the altar to remind the people of God's provision of water in the time of the wilderness wanderings. Another that was associated with the Feast of Tabernacles was the lighting of 4 great lampstands which were set up in the court of the women in the temple. And this ceremony was called the illumination of the temple. At night time, when it was getting dark, these 4 lampstands would have been lit and would have filled the temple courts there with this great light. And the light from these lampstands was a reminder to the people of the pillar of fire which had gone before the Israelites in the wilderness. We have reference to this in Exodus chapter 13, verses 21 and 22, which says, "And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, that they might travel by day and by night. The pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night did not depart from before the people." Also in Numbers chapter 9 and verse 15, we're told of this fire as well, the cloud and the fire. Numbers chapter 9 verse 15 says, "On the day that the tabernacle was set up, the cloud covered the tabernacle, the tent of the testimony, and at evening it was over the tabernacle like the appearance of fire until the morning. So it was continually, the cloud covered it by day and the appearance of fire by night." So the lighting of these great lampstands in the temple now is a reminder to the people of that time when God had led them by that light during their 40 years in the wilderness. And so it may have been in the context of that ceremony that Jesus now came along and uttered the words, "I am the light of the world," in order to set himself in contrast to those lampstands. The theme of light is a common that we find in the Bible. A number of times God is referred to as light, or in the sense of light, in Psalm 27 and verse 1. The psalm opens up here, "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" So the opening words of the psalm, "The Lord is my light and my salvation." Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 2, the prophecy here concerning the coming of the Messiah, says, "The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwell in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shined." And then in Isaiah chapter 60 and verse 19 as well, Isaiah 60 verse 19 says, "The sun shall be no more your light by day, nor for brightness shall the moon give light to you by night, but the Lord will be your everlasting light, and your God will be your glory." So no longer is light provided by the sun and the moon, but rather the Lord will be your everlasting light. In the Old Testament, the nation of Israel was meant to be a light to the nations, reflecting the light of God to the surrounding nations. So in Isaiah chapter 42 and verse 6, the verse says, "I am the Lord, I have called you in righteousness, I have taken you by the hand and kept you, I have given you as a covenant to the people, a light to the nations, to open the eyes that are blind." So God is speaking there of the nation. "I've given you as a light to the nations." And in Isaiah chapter 49 and verse 6 as well, he says, it is too light a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the preserved of Israel. I will give you as a light to the nations, that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth." So God was going to use Israel as his light to bring light to the surrounding nations. When we come into the New Testament as well, we see the prominence of light and light associated with God. God is described as light in John's first letter, 1 John chapter 1 and verse 5. This is the message we have heard from him and proclaimed to you, that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. And in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 14, Jesus spoke there of his disciples being the light of the world. When he said, Matthew 5 verse 14, you are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hid. And his disciples to be that light. In verse 16, he says, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works, give glory to your Father who is in heaven. And also in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 15, Paul there speaks of Christians who are to shine as lights in the world. In Philippians chapter 2 verse 15, that you may be blameless and innocent children of God, without blemish in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. So we are to shine as lights in the world, to be that reflection of Christ in the world around us. John's interest in this concept of light and its contrast with darkness is found throughout his gospel, and right at the beginning in chapter 1 verses 4 and 5 he introduces this concept of light and darkness. Speaking of the one who describes as the Word, he says, in him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And then he speaks about John the Baptist, that he was one who was not the light, but had come to bear witness to the light. And in verse 9, he says, the true light that enlightens every man was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world knew him not. And then in chapter 3, verses 19 to 21, also here, he writes this, and this is the judgment, that the light has come into the world, and men loved darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. For everyone who does evil hates the light, and does not come to the light, lest his deeds should be exposed. But he who does what is true comes to the light, that it may be clearly seen that his deeds have been wrought in God. So we have this strong theme in John's writings of light, of Jesus being that light, and of walking in that light, of following that light. Here we see that the consequence of Jesus being the light of the world, back here in John chapter 8 and verse 12, the consequence of Jesus being the light of the world is, Jesus says that he who follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. So not everyone is going to benefit from Jesus being the light of the world, but only those who follow him. It'll be those who follow him who will be enlightened in that way. They are the ones who will be kept from walking in the darkness of this world. When we turn to follow Jesus, then we no longer walk in darkness, but instead we now have the light of life. Jesus, the light, will bring us life. There's a connection here made between light and life, that we will have the light of life. He is the light. Jesus is the light who gives life. Just as light is necessary for physical life, a plant needs light for it to live. If you put a plant in the darkness, it's not going to grow properly. And in the same way, Jesus is our light who gives us life. In the spiritual realm, as well as the physical, then light is something that is needed for life to exist. And Jesus' claim to be the light of the world is a claim that is understood by him to be a claim to be the Messiah. And it was understood in this way by the Pharisees when Jesus made this utterance here. So the Pharisees then respond to this claim. Jesus makes this claim, I am the light of the world. And then the Pharisees respond to this by questioning his authority and the validity of his testimony. In verse 13, they say to him, "You are bearing witness to yourself. Your testimony is not true." So they suggest that what Jesus has just said about himself, being the light, did not comply with the legal requirements for a valid testimony. His testimony would not be accepted in a court of law. So what the Pharisees are saying is that Jesus' statement that he is the light of the world is not sufficient evidence to prove the claim. You can't just go around saying these things. You have to substantiate that claim. They would see it just as someone making a boast about something which could not be confirmed, and therefore it could not be true. But Jesus insists that his testimony is true, even if he is bearing witness to himself. Back in chapter 5 and verse 31, he'd said there, "If I bear witness to myself, my testimony is not true." And there in chapter 5, he agreed that unsupported testimony would not be accepted. And in that case, he went on to identify the witnesses who supported his testimony. He spoke of the Father, John the Baptist, his works, and the scriptures as all bearing testimony to his identity. But here in chapter 8, in verses 14 to 18, he takes a slightly different approach. Here he says that he is qualified to bear witness to himself. He says, "Even if I do bear witness to myself, my testimony is true." So if I'm the only one who's saying this, my testimony is true. I am telling the truth. And the reason for this, he says, is because he knows his origin and his destination. He says, "I know whence I have come and whither I'm going." I know where I've come from and I know where I'm going. But in contrast, the Pharisees do not know his origin or his destination. And so he can bear witness to himself, and his testimony is true because of who he is, because he knows who he is. He's conscious of his authority, and he has no need for other witnesses to back him up. He knows who he is, and so when he says, "I am the light of the world," that claim is based on his perfect self-knowledge. But the Pharisees do not know that. They have no such knowledge. The basis of their judgment is the flesh. In verse 15, he says, "You judge according to the flesh." Judgment based on the flesh, that is superficial judgment, judgment by external considerations or by earthly standards or judging by appearances, that form of judgment will be weak and it will be imperfect. In the flesh, we cannot make perfect judgments because our knowledge is always incomplete. But in contrast to their judging according to the flesh or according to appearances, Jesus says, "I judge no one." We might wonder, well, what does Jesus mean by this? "I judge no one." And how can we reconcile his words here with those which in chapter 9 and verse 39, where he said, "For judgment I came into this world"? So here he's saying, "I judge no one." Later he says, "For judgment I came into this world." A couple of points perhaps we should note on that. First of all, Jesus' primary purpose in coming into the world at this time was not to judge, but rather to bring salvation. John tells us this back in chapter 3 and verse 17. He says, "For God sent the Son into the world not to condemn the world, but that the world might be saved through him." So he came not to judge or not to condemn, but rather to save. And then later on in chapter 12, verse 47, here he says, "If anyone hears my sayings and does not keep them, I do not judge him, for I did not come to judge the world, but to save the world." That was the purpose for Jesus coming at that time, was for salvation rather than judgment. Later, yes, he will judge later, but for this time he has come to offer salvation. And then another point we should note on this is that Jesus did not practice the type of judgment that was practiced by the Pharisees, as is shown to us in the case of the woman who was caught in adultery, and how they had judged her in bringing her to Jesus. So the apparent contradiction with chapter 9, verse 39 can be explained in this way, that judgment is really a natural consequence of Jesus' presence in the world. When Jesus comes into the world, people will either be for him or they will be against him. And people will pass judgment upon themselves by their response to Jesus. So it's not that Jesus is coming directly to judge people, but rather simply him being there is going to cause people to judge themselves, to pass judgment upon themselves by the way in which they react to him. Jesus now speaks in verse 16 of his type of judgment, the way in which he judges. He says, "Yet even if I do judge, my judgment is true, for it is not I alone that judge, but I and he who sent me." Jesus' judgment is not according to the flesh. It's not according to external appearances, as is the Pharisees, but rather Jesus' judgment is always true judgment. And this is because his judgment arises from his relationship with the Father. So he says that it's not he alone who is judging, but rather he and the Father who sent him. And so that judgment will always be true. It will always be correct. Jesus now refers to the law in verses 17 and 18. He speaks of it as your law, and addressing the Pharisees here. And the law said that the testimony of two witnesses would be accepted as a valid testimony. We can see this in a few places, in Deuteronomy chapter 17 and verse 6. Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 6, which says, "On the evidence of two witnesses or of three witnesses, he that is to die shall be put to death. A person shall not be put to death on the evidence of one witness." So 2 or 3 witnesses were necessary. Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 15 as well. "A single witness shall not prevail against a man for any crime or for any wrong in connection with any offence that he has committed. Only on the evidence of 2 witnesses or of 3 witnesses shall a charge be sustained." And then in Numbers chapter 35 and verse 30, Numbers 35 and verse 30, if anyone kills a person, the murderer shall be put to death on the evidence of witnesses, but no person shall be put to death on the testimony of one witness. So that the law was clear. The law said you can't condemn a person simply on the evidence of one witness. You needed at least two or more witnesses. So on the basis of that principle, then Jesus says here in verses 17 and 18, "I bear witness to myself, and the Father who sent me bears witness to me." So if the Pharisees are arguing, well, your testimony is not true because you're just one person bearing witness to yourself. Well, Jesus says, here are the 2 witnesses. There's myself and there's the Father. These are the 2 witnesses which make his testimony valid. Well, the Pharisees now ask him, well, where's your Father? If you're saying that your Father is the other witness here, where is your Father? And Jesus' reply is, "You know neither me nor my Father. If you knew me, you would know my Father also." So the Father can only be known if the Son himself is known, that it is through the Son that we come to know the Father. But the Pharisees do not know the Son, and that is that they do not accept Jesus. They do not accept who he is, so they don't know him. And if they don't know him, then they cannot know the Father either. Well, John concludes it at this point with verse 20, and he tells us that this discussion took place in the treasury. The treasury is not a building or a room, but the treasury was a container, a receptacle where the offerings would be put, and it was located in the court of the women there in the temple. Reference is made to it in Mark's Gospel, Mark chapter 12 and verse 41, and the case of the widow here is during Jesus' final week when he's in the temple again. He sat down opposite the treasury and watched the multitude putting money into the treasury. Many rich people put in large sums, and then the widow comes along and puts in her 2 copper coins there. So this was where this was taking place, in the court of the women, where the treasury, these receptacles for receiving those offerings. And it was here in this place that Jesus was teaching. And John notes again in verse 20 here that Jesus was not arrested at this time because his hour had not yet come. So there seems to be a bit of a break now between verse 20 and verse 21. John picks up the story in verse 21 down to verse 30. He says, "Again, he said to them, I go away and you will seek me and die in your sin. Where I am going, you cannot come." Then said the Jews, "Will he kill himself, since he says, where I am going, you cannot come?" He said to them, "You are from below, I am from above. You are of this world, I am not of this world. I told you that you would die in your sins, for you will die in your sins, unless you believe that I am he." They said to him, "Who are you?" Jesus said to them, "Even what I have told you from the beginning. I have much to say about you and much to judge, but he who sent me is true, and I declare to the world what I have heard from him." They did not understand that he spoke to them of the Father. So Jesus said, "When you have lifted up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am he, and that I do nothing on my own authority, but speak thus as the Father taught me. And he who sent me is with me. He has not left me alone, for I always do what is pleasing him." As he spoke thus, many believed in him. So the theme continues here. This seems to be another occasion there. Verse 20 concluded that part of the discussion, and now John is recording another incident happening at the same time in the same context. And this time, again, it's the discussion concerns the identity of Jesus and his relationship with the Father. Just who is this Jesus? And Jesus tells the Jews here that he's going away. He says, "I go away and you will seek me and die in your sin. Where I am going, you cannot come." He had said something similar to this earlier in chapter 7, verses 33 and 34. There he said, "I shall be with you a little longer, and then I go to him who sent me. You will seek me and you will not find me. Where I am, you cannot come." On that earlier occasion, the Jews had wondered whether he now intended to go to the Jews of the dispersion and teach the Greeks. This time, his words also puzzle them, and they are wondering now whether he intends to kill himself. They ask, will he kill himself? He says, "Where I am going, you cannot come." On both of the occasions where Jesus said this, his going away was a reference to his death and to his return to the Father. They would not be able to follow him there because of their unbelief and their disobedience. And concerning the Jews here, Jesus says to them, "You will seek me and die in your sin." Jesus is giving them a warning here. He doesn't say the reason why they might seek him, whether that they're seeking him in order to do him harm, or whether they're seeking him as the Messiah, only to find out that they're now too late for that. To die in your sin would indicate that they die without repentance and without forgiveness. So they die in that state of separation from God. The Jews' question here, will he kill himself? The wording of it expects a negative reply. It's more literally, surely he will not kill himself. Surely he's not going to kill himself. Suicide was regarded as a serious sin with severe consequences in the afterlife. And it was said that the deepest part of hell was reserved for those who committed suicide. So perhaps in saying this, in saying this, in effect saying, well, if he commits suicide, if he kills himself, we won't be able to follow him. We won't be able to go where he is going. His statement here, where I am going, you cannot come, is found 3 times in this gospel. We've already mentioned it was back in chapter 7, verse 34. It's here in chapter 8, and then the 3rd time is in chapter 13, verse 33, when he's speaking with his disciples in the upper room on that final night. He says, little children, yet a little while I am with you. You will seek me, and as I said to the Jews, so now I say to you, where I am going, you cannot come. So Jesus repeats that there to his own disciples on that occasion as well. Where I am going, you cannot come. Jesus then draws a contrast between himself and the Jews here in verses 23 and 24. He says that they are from below, and he is from above. They are of this world, and he is not of this world. A contrast between where they exist, where they live. Though they're from below, he's from above. They're of this world, he is not of this world. The Jews belong to the world. They follow worldly standards of behavior rather than seeking to do God's will. And for this reason, they take an earthly view of things rather than try to see things from a heavenly perspective. And consequently, unless they do come to believe in Jesus, then they will die in their sins. So Jesus says here that they must believe that I am he. Actually, there's no he in the Greek text here. Jesus simply says, unless you believe that I am. And perhaps he's alluding here to the divine name, the name that God revealed to Moses there at the burning bush, that he's using that divine name of himself, that it means I am what I really am. So they must believe that that's the one that he is, that he really is that one. Jesus' words here, that they must believe that I am, then leads to a discussion about his identity in verse 25. After he has said that, unless you will die in your sins, unless you believe that I am he, unless you believe that I am. And then they ask, who are you? And then Jesus' response there, even what I have told you from the beginning. There's a difference in some of the translations here. It seems to be a difficult phrase to translate. The Revised Standard Version has it, Jesus saying, even what I have told you from the beginning. His answer to their question, who are you? Even what I have told you from the beginning, meaning, in effect, I am what I've been telling you all along. I've been telling you this all along. The New International Version follows something similar. Just what I have been claiming all along. Who are you? Well, just what I've been claiming all along. The Revised Standard footnote, the margin, offers an alternative. It could be, why do I talk to you at all? It's more of a literal translation of the words. Why do I talk to you at all? That's in the New Revised Standard Version, the main text in there. Why do I speak to you at all? Meaning, why do I continue to talk to you when you refuse to recognize who I am? What's the point in me carrying on saying these things because you're not listening? Why should I bother even talking to you? The New English Bible translates it that way as well. Why should I speak to you at all? So in effect, Jesus is saying, I've been telling you all along, this is who I am. I've been telling you all along. That's the point, really, of his answer, that he's been telling them who he is, and they still refuse to believe who he is. Jesus then says that he has much to say to them, to say about them, and much to judge, but now is not the time for those things. He's not here, as he said, to judge. Jesus has been sent into the world by the Father, by the one who is true, and his mission is to declare to the world the things that he has heard from the Father. That's his purpose. That's why he's there. Father sent him into the world. The Father is the one who is true, and his mission, his work, is to declare those things that the Father has revealed to him to the world. But the Jews, again, they did not understand that he was talking about the Father. Verse 27, John says, they did not understand that he spoke to them of the Father. He has said, he speaks of the one who sent me is true. I declare to the world what I've heard from him. And they didn't even get it. They didn't understand that Jesus was referring to the Father here. Again, it shows the limitations of their understanding here. But Jesus then continued by speaking of his death. In verse 28, he says, when you have lifted up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am he. So it will take the crucifixion before they know who Jesus is. The cross will be a revelation to them of Jesus' identity. And once again, Jesus emphasizes that he's not acting on his own in this. He does not speak on his own authority, but he speaks as the Father has taught him. And verse 29 reveals the closeness of that relationship between the Son and the Father. He who sent me is with me. He has not left me alone, for I always do what is pleasing to him. He's come to do the will of God, come to do the will of the Father. And he says, he's not left me alone. I'm always seeking to do what is pleasing to him. And John then records the results of this conversation in verse 30. He says, as he spoke thus, many believed in him. So many of those who heard these words of Jesus now believed in him, which might come as a bit of a surprise to us, although when we get into the following verses, referring to those who had believed, it would seem that it's not really a deep-rooted belief, but more of a superficial belief, which will again very soon turn into hostility as well. So that concludes the passage that we're looking at this evening. And there's a few questions to consider, to reflect upon here. What qualities does light possess that make it an appropriate image of Jesus? And why did the Pharisees struggle to believe in Jesus? And why do people today also struggle to believe? And how does Jesus describe the relationship between himself and the Father? Last week, it was suggested that we might spend a few minutes perhaps talking about some of these questions. So I think if Chris can stop the recording.